The summer of 2019 brought record rainfall to Millbrook, Illinois, a quiet suburb where children still rode bikes until the streetlights came on and parents knew their neighbors by name. It was the kind of place where the most dangerous thing a 12-year-old might encounter was a scraped knee from falling off a swing set. That changed on the afternoon of July the 23rd, when Ethan Riley disappeared into a storm drain and emerged 4 days later with no memory of where he had been, and a phrase carved into his arm that no one could explain. Ethan Riley was an ordinary boy in every measurable way. Average height for his age, sandy brown hair that perpetually fell across his eyes, and a quiet disposition that kept him on the periphery of most playground activities. His teachers described him as thoughtful but unremarkable, the type of student who completed assignments without fanfare and rarely spoke unless called upon. His parents, David and Margaret Riley, had moved to Millbrook 3 years earlier for David's job at the regional power plant, seeking the kind of safe, predictable environment they believed would give their only child the best possible childhood. The drainage system behind Millbrook Elementary School had been a source of fascination for local children for decades. Built in the 1960s to manage seasonal flooding, the network of concrete tunnels stretched beneath much of the older section of town, connecting to the main storm water management facility near the interstate. Most of the access points had been sealed with heavy grates following a drowning incident in 1994, but the tunnel opening behind the school had been damaged during construction work 2 years earlier, leaving a gap just wide enough for a child to squeeze through. On that Tuesday afternoon, as rain drummed against the classroom windows during the final period of summer school, 3 boys made plans that would change everything. Marcus Webb and Tyler Hoffman, both 13 and known for their willingness to accept any dare, had been discussing the tunnel opening for weeks. They had heard older kids talk about exploring the drainage system, about the echoing chambers and underground passages that connected different parts of town. When classes ended and the rain began to lighten, they convinced Ethan Riley to join them for what they called an adventure. The toy that would serve as both excuse and catalyst was a small red action figure that had been thrown onto the school roof during recess the previous week. Heavy rains had washed it down the gutters and into the drainage system, where it could be seen through the tunnel opening, just visible in the dim light about 10 feet from the entrance. Marcus Webb would later tell investigators that retrieving the toy had been Ethan's idea, though Tyler Hoffman insisted it was a group decision. What neither boy disputed was that Ethan Riley, despite being the smallest and quietest of the 3, was the one who volunteered to squeeze through the opening. The entrance to the drainage tunnel was barely 3 feet in diameter, partially obscured by overgrown weeds and accumulated debris from years of storm runoff. The concrete was stained with rust and algae, and the interior disappeared into darkness after just a few feet. City records would later show that this particular section connected to a larger distribution tunnel approximately 30 feet underground, though the passage was supposed to have been sealed with a metal grate during safety upgrades completed in 2017. At approximately 3:47 p.m., according to the timestamps on security footage from the school's rear parking lot, Ethan Riley disappeared feet first into the tunnel opening. Marcus Webb and Tyler Hoffman waited outside, calling encouragement and jokes into the darkness. When Ethan's voice echoed back to them initially, they felt no concern. He was moving slowly, he told them, and the toy was further back than they had thought. The last coherent words they heard from him were a complaint about the smell and a request for one of them to bring a flashlight from the school's maintenance shed. What happened next remains unclear. Both boys claim they continued calling to Ethan for several minutes, receiving occasional responses that grew fainter and more difficult to understand. Tyler Hoffman would later insist that Ethan's voice began to sound strange, as if he were speaking from much further away than should have been possible given the tunnel's known dimensions. Marcus Webb maintained that the responses simply stopped and that they assumed Ethan was either playing a prank or had found another way out of the system. After waiting for nearly an hour, with evening approaching and their own parents expecting them home, Marcus Webb and Tyler Hoffman made the decision that would haunt them for years to come. Instead of immediately seeking help, they convinced themselves that Ethan had emerged from another tunnel opening and gone home on his own. They would claim they even looked for other exits, though neither could provide specific details about where they had searched or for how long. It was Margaret Riley's call to the Millbrook Police Department at 7:23 p.m. that officially began what would become one of the most puzzling missing child cases in the county's history. Ethan had not returned home for dinner, which was unlike him, and he was not answering his cell phone. When Margaret contacted the parents of his known friends, she learned about the planned exploration of the drainage tunnel. Within minutes, she and David Riley were at the school, flashlights in hand, calling their son's name into the dark opening behind the building. The Millbrook Fire Department's rescue team arrived at 8:15 p.m., equipped with rope systems, portable lighting, and breathing apparatus designed for confined space operations. Captain James Morrison, a 23-year veteran of emergency services, would later describe the initial assessment as routine but concerning. The tunnel opening was indeed large enough for a child to enter, and there were clear signs of recent disturbance in the accumulated sediment just inside the entrance. What Captain Morrison and his team discovered during their initial exploration defied the assumptions everyone had made about the drainage system's layout. The tunnel, which city engineering records indicated should have terminated at a sealed junction after approximately 50 feet, actually continued much further into the hillside. More troubling, the passage appeared to have been modified at some point, with sections of the original concrete work removed or damaged in ways that suggested deliberate excavation rather than natural erosion. The search expanded rapidly as the scope of the problem became clear. By midnight, teams from 3 neighboring fire departments were involved, along with specialized rescue divers from the county sheriff's office and a K-9 unit trained in search and rescue operations. The assumption driving these efforts was straightforward. Ethan Riley had become lost or trapped somewhere in the tunnel system, and time was critical for his survival. For 3 days, the search continued with increasing desperation and decreasing hope. Every accessible section of the drainage network was systematically explored and mapped. Divers checked retention ponds and water management facilities for any sign that Ethan might have been swept into the active stormwater system. Search dogs were brought to dozens of tunnel openings throughout Millbrook and the surrounding area, seeking any trace of the missing boy's scent. The investigation revealed details about the drainage system that disturbed everyone involved. City maintenance records showed significant discrepancies between the official layouts and the actual tunnel configurations found during the search. Several passages that should have been sealed were found open, while others marked as accessible on engineering drawings had been blocked with concrete and debris. Most unsettling, multiple search team members reported finding areas where the tunnel walls showed signs of recent excavation or modification, though city officials insisted no authorized work had been performed in those sections for over a decade. David and Margaret Riley maintained a vigil at the search command post, providing investigators with every detail they could remember about their son's habits, fears, and capabilities. Ethan was not particularly athletic, they explained, but he was curious and surprisingly brave when something captured his interest. He had never shown any tendency toward running away, and he was generally cautious about physical risks. The idea that he would venture deep into an unfamiliar underground space without planning or equipment seemed completely inconsistent with his personality. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not from the extensive search efforts, but from a source no one had anticipated. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on July the 27th, 4 days after Ethan's disappearance, a farmer named Robert Chen discovered a small figure standing motionless in his cornfield 6 miles south of Millbrook. The figure was barefoot, wearing the same clothes Ethan Riley had worn to school the previous Tuesday, and staring silently toward a line of oak trees that marked the eastern boundary of the Chen property. Robert Chen would later tell investigators that his first thought was that he had stumbled upon a scarecrow that had been displaced by the previous night's wind. The figure stood so still and seemed so disconnected from its surroundings that it took several seconds for Chen to realize he was looking at a living child. When he called out, Ethan Riley turned slowly to face him, but showed no recognition, no relief, and no apparent awareness of where he was or how he had arrived there. The reunion between Ethan and his parents at Millbrook General Hospital was not the joyful conclusion everyone had hoped for. The boy who had been found in Robert Chen's cornfield seemed fundamentally different from the child who had disappeared 4 days earlier. He was physically unharmed, no injuries, no signs of dehydration or exposure, no indication that he had spent days underground or outdoors without food or shelter. But emotionally and mentally, Ethan Riley appeared to be struggling with something that no one around him could understand. For the first 6 hours after his recovery, Ethan spoke only when directly questioned, and his responses were brief and seemingly disconnected from the experiences everyone assumed he must have endured. When asked where he had been, he said only that it was dark and loud. When pressed for more details about his location during the missing days, he became agitated and insisted that they didn't want him to leave, though he could not or would not explain who they were. The most disturbing discovery came during Ethan's medical examination, when hospital staff noticed what appeared to be fresh scratches on his left forearm. Upon closer inspection, the marks were revealed to be deliberately carved letters forming the phrase, "They stay hungry." The carving was shallow but precise, clearly intentional, and showed signs of recent healing that suggested it had been made within the previous day or two. Ethan claimed no memory of how the words had appeared on his arm, and medical staff could find no tools or implements that might have been used to create the markings. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Millbrook Police Department took charge of the investigation into Ethan's missing days, though she quickly discovered that standard investigative techniques were inadequate for understanding what had occurred. Ethan's clothing showed no signs of extended wear or exposure to underground conditions. His shoes, which he had been wearing when he entered the drainage tunnel, were never found, though his feet showed no evidence of walking long distances over rough terrain. Most puzzling forensic analysis of his clothes revealed no traces of the specific soil, algae, or chemical residues that characterized the drainage system where he had disappeared. The phrase carved into Ethan's arm became the focus of extensive analysis and speculation. Linguistic experts consulted by the police could find no clear meaning or origin for the words, "They stay hungry," though several noted that the phrasing had an archaic quality that seemed inconsistent with contemporary speech patterns. Psychological evaluations suggested that the carving had not been self-inflicted, both because of its location and because of the precision required to create such clear lettering. Yet no physical evidence could explain how someone else might have marked the boy's arm without his knowledge or memory. In the weeks following Ethan's return, his parents noticed changes in their son that went far beyond the trauma anyone might expect from such an experience. He became withdrawn and anxious, particularly during evening hours, and developed an intense aversion to enclosed spaces that made returning to school nearly impossible. Most concerning, he began displaying knowledge of local history and geography that he had never learned, particularly details about the early settlement of Millbrook and the construction of the original drainage infrastructure in the 1960s. The investigation into Ethan's disappearance gradually lost momentum as leads failed to develop and physical evidence remained limited. The drainage tunnel where he had vanished was permanently sealed with concrete barriers, and the entire system was subject to safety inspections that revealed numerous violations of current engineering standards. City officials attributed these discrepancies to incomplete record-keeping and decades of informal modifications, though several inspection team members privately expressed concerns about the deliberate nature of some tunnel alterations. Marcus Webb and Tyler Hoffman, the two boys who had been with Ethan when he disappeared, struggled with guilt and confusion that affected their own families and friendships. Both underwent counseling to address their decision not to seek immediate help when Ethan failed to emerge from the tunnel, and both insisted that they had heard Ethan's voice for much longer than should have been possible, given their current understanding of the drainage system's layout. Their accounts of that afternoon remained consistent through multiple interviews, though investigators noted that certain details, particularly their descriptions of the sounds and voices they heard, seemed to shift subtly each time they told the story. The Chen family's cornfield, where Ethan had been discovered, became the subject of its own investigation when Robert Chen reported finding unusual disturbances in the soil near where the boy had been standing. Specifically, he described a circular area approximately 10 feet in diameter where the corn had been flattened in a pattern that suggested downward pressure rather than wind damage. Agricultural extension agents who examined the site could find no natural explanation for the damage pattern, though they noted that the affected plants showed signs of rapid recovery that was inconsistent with typical crop damage. As autumn arrived and the immediate crisis faded, the Riley family faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives around questions that had no apparent answers. Ethan's memories of his missing days remained fragmentary and troubling, filled with references to voices, darkness, and a persistent sense that he had been somewhere he was not supposed to be. Therapy sessions revealed few additional details, though his therapist noted that Ethan consistently described his experience in terms that suggested confinement rather than exploration. The phrase, "they stay hungry," continued to appear in Ethan's drawings and school assignments, always written in the same precise lettering that matched the carving on his arm. When asked about its meaning, he would only say that it was important to remember, though he could not explain why or what consequences might result from forgetting. His teachers reported that he seemed to be listening for something during quiet moments, turning his head toward walls or closed doors as if expecting to hear familiar voices. Detective Martinez's final report on the case, filed in November 2019, officially classified Ethan Riley's disappearance as resolved, though she privately acknowledged that virtually none of the fundamental questions had been answered. The boy had been returned safely to his family. No crime had been definitively established, and no ongoing threat to public safety could be identified. Yet the inconsistencies and unexplained elements of the case continued to trouble everyone who had been involved in the investigation. The drainage system beneath Millbrook was eventually redesigned and rebuilt, with all access points permanently sealed and new safety measures implemented throughout the network. City officials described the project as a necessary infrastructure upgrade, though internal documents revealed that the decision had been driven largely by the disturbing discoveries made during Ethan's search. Several tunnel sections were filled with concrete rather than simply sealed, and the entire eastern portion of the system was rerouted to avoid areas where unexplained modifications had been found. Today, Ethan Riley is 15 years old and attending high school in a different state, where his family relocated following David Riley's transfer to another power plant facility. Those who knew him before his disappearance report that he seems to have adapted well to his new environment, though he remains reserved and thoughtful in ways that suggest his experience left permanent changes. The scar on his forearm has faded but remains visible, a daily reminder of 4 days that no one has been able to explain. The cornfield where Ethan was found has been converted to residential development, with no indication that the new homeowners are aware of its connection to one of the area's most puzzling missing child cases. Robert Chen, who discovered the boy that morning, moved to Florida 2 years later, telling neighbors that he had never felt comfortable on his property after that summer. The questions surrounding Ethan Riley's disappearance continue to resonate for those who remember the case. Where was he during those 4 missing days? How did he travel 6 miles from the drainage tunnel to the Chen property without leaving any trace of his journey? Who or what carved the phrase into his arm? And what did it mean? Most troubling of all, what was the source of the voices and presences that Ethan remembered from his time away, and why did he believe they had not wanted him to leave? The official case file remains open, though no active investigation is ongoing. Detective Martinez, now retired, occasionally receives calls from other law enforcement agencies describing similar cases. Children who disappear into confined spaces and emerge days later with no memory of their experiences and unexplained marks or knowledge. She maintains an informal network of investigators who share information about such incidents, though no clear pattern has emerged to explain these events. The storm drain behind Millbrook Elementary School is now completely inaccessible, sealed beneath layers of concrete and marked with warnings that carry the weight of experience. But on summer afternoons, when rain drums against classroom windows, some teachers report that children still gather near the sealed entrance, drawn by stories they have heard about the boy who went into the darkness and came back changed. They peer into shadows that no longer exist, listening for voices that may still be calling from spaces that were never meant to be found.